All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome back. Love to see you. You are listening to the Mystai Podcast, and we have another wonderful returning guest who I am also very happy to call my friend, who we have had numerous conversations since our last podcast. But Ben Stimpson, author of Ancestral Whispers with Llewellyn, and I want to say more recently, that's not the right word to use, forthcoming, author of
Forthcoming.
Wise Ones with Frost Crow. Thank you so much for coming back on, Ben. Love to see you.
Oh, it was so good to see you too. And I'm really, it's weird considering when we last met, I vaguely couldn't talk about what was coming out, and now I'm a published author, and here we are.
Yeah, well, this has been kind of like the interesting theme. Like we were just, we were shooting the shit before this, weren't we? But this has kind of been the interesting theme with this new round of podcasts that I'm coming at a lot of the older people who came on my podcast originally when I was like 19, 20, and now we're coming back 4 years later and seeing like what's changed, how people have matured, how they've grown, like what's gone on in their lives. And yeah, it's interesting because I remember the first podcast we did. Like I remember when we first started, you barely even knew what book was coming out. Like you didn't even know what it was about. And we was like initially.
Well, I did, but I couldn't tell.
Okay, yeah,
I did.
you did, but like, we were talking about like which publisher you're going to go with, all that kind of thing. And now you're like a fully published author with Llewellyn, and it's like fully marketed and all that kind of thing. It's doing great.
It's been a wild journey for all of us, right? It's been a wild journey,
Yeah.
and it's weird to think it's been like 2.5, 3 years since that came.
Doesn't feel like it.
No. No, we've all grown, right? all grown older.
Well, we would hope, or at least biologically, we have at least to put it that way. Yeah. So, what's been going on since then? Like, how have things been?
Yeah, since we last came together, of course, I was mid-editing process. Couldn't really talk much about what was coming out, what it was. And then last year, it really exploded. I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about community. I've learned a lot about boundary setting and really connecting with me and my needs. I've developed some incredible friendships through this. I mean, you being one of them. But some of the bigger names, and I know Vale Blanchard being called a bigger name, but they are like some of the writers that I've been reading for years, and now I have them in my Facebook DMs sending me memes about crap that just, it's like, what is this, right? What is this world? Some of the conversations I've had, some of the challenging conversations I've had around even things that I thought I knew, I realize how little I know now. This is the big thing. Like the humility piece has really come in, and it doesn't seem like it because my sheet looks really impressive now, but like I've in going through processing all of this and writing another book after this Ancestral Whispers came out, I really did realize how much I don't know, and that's exciting because that humility piece is big. So it's I've written another book since Wise Ones is coming out, and Wise Ones are very different from Ancestral Whispers, which is more of a guide to ancestral veneration. Wise Ones is pure folklore, pure heading into the folklore record, looking at the stories of witches, cunning folk, which we don't often see in narratives now, and the history of those people. So much has happened. I don't even know where to go with this.
No, it's great. Yeah, I mean, if we start with your new book, then I guess because this is something I guess will be on people's minds. We were talking before. It's almost 180,000 words, which is amazing. It's a huge encyclopedic entry, which is amazing. And Cunning Folk is it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because a lot of my exposure to kind of Cunning Folk stuff has either been through like Jim Baker's Cunning Man's Handbook or through Al Cummins' stuff. And that's like my two avenues for it. But one of the things that always strikes me very interestingly with the Cunning Folk is, at least, and I think it's Ronald Hutton who's mentioned this, but like the majority, if not all of them, are Christian. Like they hold like dual faith at the very least, but the majority are all Christian. So we have this kind of interesting perception that Cunning Folk are kind of the white witches, or I don't really like the term, but how we define the term witch, that kind of thing. But they are still working in a fundamentally Christian worldview, right?
This is the thing. This is what was really challenging for me the past couple of years in diving into this. And I say, I mean, over the past couple of years, I actually started putting this book together in December, and I got it in by May. So it was really, really very short term.
Yeah.
But I was like, I was on a time schedule because I was going to lose access to JSTOR because I was an alumni, so I had to
Right.
get in there.
Mhm.
But this is the thing, you know, we hear about these stories of wise men or wise women, right? We hear these stories of vaguely these stories of going and, you know, going and meeting the man who's going to help you find a cow, right? That's still kind of in the lexicon. But the majority of the, at least from the neo-pagan perspective, the majority of the conversation around witches and witchcraft and magic is the witch trials, right?
Mm.
With this book, I was very particular. I was not interested in writing another book on the witch trials, right? The lore of the witch trials. When you look at traditional witchcraft, as it's kind of put out there by various different branches now, majority of them will look to the witch trial accounts as
Mm.
this is the authentic sabbatic witchcraft that was existing,
Mm.
while ignoring all of these other pieces around magic and the history around magic since the 1600s.
Mm.
So it was fascinating to deep dive into these 230-ish figures, look at their stories, look at how over the past 400 years these stories have evolved in relationship with that actual history. And it's true, like you said, majority of them would consider themselves Christian. They were really on the coattails of those medieval astrologers and those medieval wise people going back that saw themselves within a Christian worldview, utilizing Christian tradition and Christian scripture in their magical work, while also incorporating, you know, what was kind of connected to the grimoire tradition, what
Mm.
was coming out of the almanac tradition of the 1700s and 1800s, right? The astrologers like Zadkiel, right? And all of that proliferation of information in the 1700s onwards. So it was interesting.
Mm.
And I think one of the biggest pieces was how many of these stories are no longer talked about. You
Right.
open any folklore book from the 1800s, they're there, they're part of the witchcraft section,
Mm.
right? But nowadays, modern pagans, you say Cunning Folk, like Jim Baker's book was amazing,
Mm.
but it's not a folklore book. It's looking at
Right.
the
It's very much
reality of
kind of
these
an
people.
analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was really it was fascinating, and then to contrast that to then these stories, these eyewitness accounts, these legendary accounts of the different forms of magic in Welsh and English. That's the focus, Welsh and
Mm.
English traditions, and now working on Scotland and Ireland as a sequel. So it's interesting again to see the other cultural milieu, you know.
Mm.
So it's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah, because I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of focus on, I guess, predominantly like English and Scottish witch trials. You know, especially in like especially in like the Wicca community because they focus on stuff like Isabel Gowdy and like the, you know, like Emma Wilby's talked about that kind of stuff before as well. But comparatively, there's it's one of those interesting things I always hear. Like whenever I read a folklore book about witch trials, or just about cunning folk in general, there's always kind of a throwaway line in there where I see authors go, "Oh well, something very different's going on in Wales." And then
Mhm.
no one ever really expands on what's going on. So they kind of just say, "Oh, it's something very different happening," but no one really goes into the Welsh like cunning folk tradition. So that's I guess that's an interesting, different kind of thing. So what do you make of it?
Well, there's a reason for that. There's a
Mm.
really important reason for that, which is the language barrier, right? There's
Right.
not as much written. There's not as many people focused on Welsh, on the Welsh tradition.
Mm.
Certainly, we have now in the neo-pagan sense, people like Mara Starling and Chris
Right.
Hughes
Sure.
and some of those writers. But from an academic standpoint, even Ronald Hutton, as much as I love Professor Hutton, a lot of his work, and he will admit it himself, like because of that language barrier.
Yeah.
There are writers coming out now. Richard Suggett is one of them who wrote a wonderful treatise on the Welsh witch trials. There's also a very interesting element there, which is there actually aren't many Welsh witch trials,
Interesting.
right? When you look at the actual number of witch trials, as we would call them in England, there's only actually about 40 in the whole span of the history. where
Mm.
people were brought up on charges, and only 5 executions, whereas in Wales and, of course, Scotland, definitely, there was a
Yeah.
huge number, a much, much bigger number. And that's because the conception of witchcraft was different in Wales. They actually had to take the English word witch and brought that into the language when the law codes were being
Oh, interesting.
enforced.
So did they not have a native word for it?
They do, but it's a different concept. So they would
Right.
have, like, for example, conjurer or consider, right? Would be anybody who's working with spirits, right?
Mm.
You have this word Finian huspis or Finian huspis, right? Which is closest to what we would call a witch. But you also have this idea of witchcraft not being necessarily malefic, because everybody was doing malefic witchcraft
Mm.
as part of the cultural folk tradition that was kind of the hangover from the Catholic regimes, right?
Right.
And so, kind of unlike in England, where a witch was somebody who sold their soul to the devil and thus was something unhuman, in Wales, everybody was doing witchcraft and everyone was doing magic. It
Mm.
really depending on what was going on. And like his point, Richard Suggett's main point, is the focus of kind of why witchcraft was seen as evil in Wales, in England, was because it was subversive. In
Mm.
Wales, what was more subversive was theft, because it was an
Interesting.
agrarian society. These were small communities. And so his point was that thievery was more of a social taboo than practicing witchcraft. Because if
Mm.
you stole something, that could have a knock-on effect of really destroying and disrupting social connections in tiny rural communities. That was a
Mm.
big thing. And so a lot of the laws were about anti-theft. This is also why Dinian Huspis, the Cunning Folk, were a lot more like, there's tons of stories I found in Wales,
Mm.
because they, of course, helped to find the
Right, I
thieves.
was gonna say because it would make them more popular. Because like one of the big stock trades of the Cunning Folk is returning lost property or finding like returning
Yes.
stolen items. Yeah.
And punishing those who did it, right?
Right.
So it's a
Absolutely.
very interesting way of looking at it,
Mm.
and that comes through in the English language Welsh tradition. You certainly, like, the content, and you also see that in the Welsh language content, definitely.
Mm. That's really that's interesting. It also makes me wonder actually. So like, do we have because something you mentioned that was really interesting is, and this is absolutely true. Like one of the big things that defines, sort of, especially sort of 16th century onwards, witchcraft beliefs is the idea that the witch is quite literally inhuman. Like their humors, like internally, are quite literally different or poisoned from,
Yeah.
other regular humans on account of their deal with the devil or whatever it is. Um, so, and this is where we get, ideas about painted blood and all that kind of thing, the familiar, I think. And this is like, I remember this was like this happened like it wasn't last month, probably 2 months ago. There was this like kind of the big explosion of argument on social media about witch blood.
Oh,
I
yes, yes,
remember it.
yes, I saw that.
Everyone saying, "Oh well, whether you're born a witch or the idea of a witch blood taking, creating this very strict hierarchy." And I was watching the whole thing, and it was really interesting to me because like there was a lot of this kind of very like vitriolic back and forth with people, and yet nobody mentioned humors or nobody mentioned the original context of like, yeah, like the witch is literally quite like it's not just a different kind of blood, like it's quite literally like it's a different being entirely. Like they're not even considered human,
Yeah.
So so I'm just wondering, like, do we have a similar kind of tradition in Wales where the witch is considered something other than human, or does that kind of focus on theft override that belief? Do you think?
It really depends. It's the same in England, it's the same in Scotland, right? It depends on what century we're looking at. And that
Sure.
really comes through in the stories, because look, when you're looking at the corpus of the stories from the 18th century, collected in the 18th century, when
Mm.
you can trace back, and that's one of the aspects of my book and why I'm really excited about this, is
Mm.
I was able to trace back the stories, some of them to chapbooks in the 16 and 1700s, right? And then some of those go even further back to the 1500s, depending. Each century and upon each retelling, you can see that the story changes to fit the current paradigm in each
Mm.
century.
Right.
Wales, you start to see a lot of those Welsh stories being collected in the 1800s. By that point, many of the like kind of the English kind of paradigms have started to come in. So
Mm.
you do have inhuman witches, but they're hags. So this modern word
Right.
gwyrach which in the 1500s, I was chatting to Christoph Hughes about this, and he writes about this in his own book, this idea of a gwyrach being an inhuman hag, right? Not understood to be human to begin with, or like the typical cannibal kind of hag that you would see, like Black Annis, for example, right? There are comparable figures to that. But when you look at the human witches, this sense of and when I say witches, that's not gendered, like both male and female. Same with Dinian Huspers for Cunning Folk. You still have this element of like the seventh son of the seventh son, right? And so you have these wonderful historical families where the power is said to come and be transmitted through lineage. The physicians of Mudfai, for example, is a really good example of that. Right, this idea of like the fairy coming out of a lake and imparting onto her children, the medical knowledge. Another example are the Dr. Harry's in Curte Cadno, right? By far one of the most popular. He and his sons are comparable to Cunning Murrell in Essex, right? So, or like Old Wrightson up in Yorkshire. So you see the sense then that the power is handed down. In other stories, you have these ideas that the power has to be given to somebody before the witch or the wizard or the magician or the conjurer dies in order to cheat the devil. And we particularly see that in Welsh tradition, is that this idea of cheating the devil so that they don't, particularly in the folkloric magician sense. So you do get those, but there's been a disparity between North Wales and South Wales, of course, depending upon the influence of the English culture there. So really, it's a mixture. You can see throughout the written contact, you can see all of these different elements coming in. We don't see that in the Mabinogion or in Mabinogi, like the legendary material. Very different sense of what.
It's very different current. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's not an easy question.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also interesting to me because I've been going down the whole archaeology road for Druids recently. So I've been going down the whole Miranda Oldhouse Green thing, looking at the archaeological evidence for Druids. And she seems to be very kind of firmly of the opinion, like regardless of whether it was at Anglesey itself or the Holy of Holies, but we have Caesar talking about how even Gaulish Druids say that they originally come from Britannia, or they got their training in Britannia. But archaeologically speaking, the earliest evidence for like Latin Celtic art is coming out of Wales and being mediated into Britain, more or less. And from what we can tell archaeologically, Wales seems to have been much more of the center of Druidic Britain than anywhere else. So it's interesting that like a very different perception of even witchcraft and magic and spirits, like I think like perseveres in that area as compared to England, which had way more Anglo-Saxon invasions. And even if we're going into North Wales and stuff as well, with a different culture, it's just like isolation. Like the isolation seems to have preserved maybe a different just attitude towards magic as opposed to what happens in England and Scotland.
I think it's what something I've really come to appreciate diving into this material is how quickly the notions change. And so when we're talking on really small timelines here in the grand scheme of things, right? Druids, 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But when we're looking at the majority of what we believe as witchcraft and witch belief and witch lore now, most of that stuff only goes back 300 years. That's it. There's some vague connection to earlier, which makes sense. That's the way the culture perpetuates. But really, a lot of these elements only go back 300 to 400 years. And you can see when you see in the retellings of some stories how the changes happen. So, whether or not there's survivals, I think that there's quite a lot of evidence in some cases. But then, as Ronald Hutton says and Owen Davies says in some of his works, right? That change happens because the culture is shifting. So, like you look at, for example, some of the ballads from Yorkshire or Northumberland that way, right? That whole Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Dara and Northumbria, right? You can see that there are elements in some of those older ballads from the medieval ages of earlier Cumbric and Strathclyde, like Kingdom of Strathclyde motifs from much earlier, because they had connections with those medieval kingdoms in Wales. but then it all shifts
It
and
just,
changes.
yeah,
So
sure.
so many pieces. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I remember. I think Ronald Harden talks about it. How almost like any remnant of what we can call kind of classic British paganism is more or less died out by the 10th century, and anything kind of pops up after it is kind of to be considered just like very sporadic, romantic kind of either inventions or just like inspirations that just died out very quickly. There is no kind of secret pagan cult or anything that's persisting.
Well, and a lot of people who don't like to think of it in this way, but it's demonstrable, is that
Mm,
a lot of the things that people are saying in the 1800s, 1700s as being pagan, right, especially amongst the Romantics, are
mm.
actually Catholic survivals.
Right, I was gonna say this, like the actual what we can say is kind of the old religion as gross. Like, I mean, like I read about this in Emma Wilby's book with Isabel Gowdy, especially. But when people talk about the old religion in fact is just Catholicism. It's just like it's folk. It's a lot of the time it's just folk Catholicism that is a remnant of the earlier church period. But because there are
It
no more
totally
Catholic
is.
ministers to guide what's going on, it's just personal interpretations of Catholic stuff, right?
It's become folk religion. It's become fully into that folk culture, which does have a long-standing memory. And I'll
Mm,
use the example of the Marburg charm with this, right? So the Marburg charm, when people who don't know, it's kind of a pan-Germanic Scandinavian tradition. You see it in Ireland too. You see it in English. Some English tradition too, and its basis, and why it's called the Marburg Charm, is its basis is actually a story of Balder and Odin going on
mm,
a journey, and their horse ends up breaking its foot or leg or whatever, and they bind it, and I think the Marburg manuscript from the 10th century has this story. Now, when you look in the 1800s and early 1900s, of stories and charms being collected in places like Orkney, northern Scotland, the Hebrides, those places. You see the charm, and like Iceland and other places, you see the charm, but it's been shifted and changed to Christ is binding the horse and whatnot. So you see
mm.
the basic structure, but all the elements
The
have
cultural kind of
shifted.
window dressings shifted. Yeah.
Exactly. And like that's like 800 years of difference, like
Mm,
thousands of miles of difference there, right? And
yeah.
yet it's continued. So folk culture does have long memory, but I think we really need to understand that in every single iteration, every single decade, every single century, the people in that time, really important here, are relating to it in the culture of that time and not thinking, oh, this is an ancient pagan charm, but we just happen to continue
Mm,
from 1,000 years ago, right? They're not seeing it that way. And we can demonstrate that by looking at the primary texts,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it also this segues beautifully into one of the other things
By the
one of
way.
the topics that I'm going to talk about kind of our relationship with culture, right, and especially with the relationship with the past and how we, to a certain extent, appropriate the past and then end up getting very reactionary against it. Which is just, the usual way of doing it. But I guess it's about how we relate to ancestral things, right? So like um, the big kind of glaring one in culture or pop culture has always been kind of the witch cult hypothesis, right? Kind of the very Margaret Murray idea. And this is obviously the founding myth for Wicca and all this kind of thing about how there is some kind of continuing ancient old religion, that kind of thing, and people are practicing witchcraft, and therefore it goes back to some, pagan contribution or whatever that survived Christianity. Now, of course, it's an interesting thing that now it's interesting. I very rarely see even modern Wiccans nowadays taking a very literalist view of that. They kind of they tend to just feel a more affinity ancestry to
Mm.
people who were persecuted to witchcraft or for witchcraft, rather than thinking that they are like direct descendants or whatever or of actual pagans, like that. So it's an interesting kind of shift of how we're acknowledging different kinds of ancestors, right? And this is like ironic because this is something you talk about, right, in Ancestral Whispers. Yeah. So take it away.
It's all coming together. It's all
Yeah,
coming together.
perfect.
Well,
I'm doing this excellent.
see, this is the thing. This is what I think I've really come to appreciate,
Mm,
particularly going through this most recent project, but also as I was writing my first book,
mm,
was again, I think I don't even know how to really say this. It's one of those things of revisionist history um, is more indicative of where people who are sitting in that revisionist history is at
mm,
and how they're relating to material. what it points to is a very long-standing kind of, I would say human, but very much Western point of view, which is that the older something is, more authentic something is. And so, you know, we can see this in the medieval ages, we can see this in classical age, we can see this now, right? The older something is, the more authentic it is, and if we can place our flag onto that and connect in lineage, then we're authentic, right? We see this with people, and I got a lot of flack for this point because people were saying that they don't see it. And what I think I realized happened is that they're subconsciously not wanting to see it. How many people do we see on message boards on Facebook say, my ancient pagan ancestors? And I think I talked about this in our first conversation, right? Like, you know, when people are going through ancestral work, wanting to connect with ancestors, they don't want to work with the Christians because they have trauma around Christianity. So what do? They connect with this one tribe 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Those are my true ancestors, right? That is saying more about where they're at in their life now than anything to do with their actual ancestry, right?
Right.
But it is interesting how people are connecting with that sense of affinity. We see a lot of traditional witches now, well, not now, for a long time, talk about the witch mother, the witch father, right? And seeing them as ancestor. We see a lot of people who, like particularly interested in cunning folk now and cunning craft, ascribe relationship with figures like Cunning Mural or with George
Neil.
Hill, right?
Yeah.
All those people, right? Even though there's no evidence of there's an actual connection there, it's still giving a foundation myth, and I think that's really important. Foundation myths. I think we underestimate the power of foundation myths because I think we're also trying to be as authentic as we can. Because, of course, bigger traditions like Christianity, the monoculture, secular culture, are so ready to just dismiss, right? So it creates that sense of, I need to have roots, I need to have identity. This happens all the time, though. Every culture has this. Every
Everything other, yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well,
I think I answered the question. I'm not sure if I did, but
yeah, no, you absolutely did. Yeah, no, the one that's in mind, and again, we're going to get very meta here, considering it only happened 2 days ago. But the thing that's on my mind is the Just of Oil protesters dousing Stonehenge in orange paint, right? And obviously, it's I will refrain from commenting on the fact that I think it's just a deplorable way to attract attention to a cause. It's just ridiculous. But there you go. I will bypass.
Refraining to say that.
I'm skirting around it as best I can. Yeah. But my point is, it's interesting. A lot of the backlash, a lot of the hate that I've seen come from the British neo-pagan community has been around this founding myth that Stonehenge is some kind of ancient British druidic temple. Now, of course, there is no archaeological evidence for that. You know, Stonehenge is a Neolithic site. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Druids, and yet there is a very core foundation myth that this is, one, a sacred site to the Britons, and two, it's somehow a sacred site to the people living there today. And even though the people living in Britain today have no direct ancestry, at least blood ancestry or connection to the original builders. So it's interesting how it's kind of, I guess it's definitely, I want to open this up for a dialogue a little bit of where this kind of reactionary thing is coming from, really. And we had some very good, interesting things to say about it when we were talking before. So let's revisit that.
Oh, this is where it starts to get into, I don't think people really like me because I say this.
Yeah. Okay.
So to me, where I've come from and where I am at now is I feel like the whole modern neo-pagan culture is very driven again on that sense of authenticity. But it's really it really comes down to that sense of entitlement over places because of trying to find spaces, right? What's interesting is that this kind of topic has happened in other communities, particularly the Catholics, when it comes to trying to lay claim to, Anglican cathedrals that used to be Catholic, right? These foundation myths really come from, again, that witch cult idea, from the romanticism of the 1900s, right? The early 1900s, this idea of, pre-pagan survival and that needing to feel in community. I think it's been interesting for me to see dialogue about this in the UK amongst UK friends, but also in the diaspora too, people in North America who are on somebody else's land. They're in Native American land, and they routinely destroy and don't care about sacred site. Not all of them. I can't say all of them. I don't want to
Sure.
generalize there, but many of them don't appreciate local kind of Native American sacred land and whatnot, because their point of view is, well, my ancestors are in
They're over there. They're
the
in
actual
Britain.
homeland. It's over there, right? So like, how dare they? I've seen people moan and bitch and complain that they even have to pay to go and see the sacred site of Stonehenge. There's no evidence whatsoever that it was ever a sacred site, that there's no connection to the Druids, all these things. And yet it's a big shock when people show up, because again, it's that narrative, that story and that narrative. That story and narrative is serving a purpose for these people. I don't want to sound just
these people, Ben, come on.
Right, it's serving a narrative, it's serving a purpose, and that narrative is often connected to that sense of self, that sense of purpose, that sense of belonging, right? So I feel like, I mean, this has been going on for a long time. How many neo-pagan, like for example, King Arthur and his Camelot, I can't think what was his name, but
Johnny Rockwell and his bunch,
right, showing up and declaring, this is pagan site, this is ours. Even though they are born to Christian parents in Christian Britain or in secular Britain, right? Everybody in the UK has a cultural connection to that space, because it's part of a landscape that they all grew up in, right? It's like, if we were to really go through all of the genetic stuff, all ancestry stuff, right? Whatever, people who have like, long-standing ancestral connection through biology to that space, chances are most of them have a relative that was around when the thing was built. Same with any other stone site, But it's interesting, again, that question of, well, why Stonehenge in particular? And that's because of that myth that's evolved around it. This was an ancient. Well, what about Avebury? What about the stone site in Ireland that has been bulldozed by a farmer who doesn't want it anymore? What about the stones of Stennis up in Scotland, right? It tells us more about where where people are at, than it does anything to do with history. And that's just it's a reality of kind of the way that culture goes, right? But it is interesting. It is also interesting how, like, one of the arguments I've seen is how damaging the paint would be to those ancient lichens that are only found in that space. Nobody seems, or not a lot of people seem to be speaking about that. It's more about the personal attack on paganism by these outsiders. Even though those outsiders are British themselves, right?
Yeah, right. And then this is the interesting thing with it, where it's like, well, at the same time, it's like there are tons of there are tons of other stone circles. Like I was on the 2017 Preseli excavation in Wales that excavated the big one over there, and it's there's a similar kind of nationalist furor to having that kind of thing as well. Yeah, but it is interesting that a lot of the focus is you are right. It's people are assuming it as an attack on paganism rather than an attack on kind of a cultural thing, and then in doing so, a lot of the actual, like, what will be the damage, because the stones itself should be fine, because it is corn flour, it will wash off in the rain, that it's not going to stones. But you're right, like the actual, like the ecology of the site is what's going to be damaged, but no one seems to be talking about that. It's much more kind of, oh well, this is an attack on paganism, which is kind of, it's interesting. Like there's also an argument if it's like triggering the older wounds there, which is kind of an interesting thing.
And look at these conversations, right? Like, nobody in the regular media is talking about that. Oh, it's in the
right. It's all kind of witch social media. Yeah.
It's only within these subcultures, right? Who, I'll be honest with you, having just gone through academia and classical studies, the majority of my professors who are teaching about ancient Greece and Rome have no idea that there's even pagans out there who are worshiping these gods, right? And I think that's something to be said, is that for the vast majority of people in the culture, in the monoculture, paganism doesn't exist. There's no concept that it even, like, paganism even exists right now. So it's really I think it's that self-perpetuating victim mentality. We see it in Christianity in the States, right? This is an attack on Christianity. What does that do? It shores up those social bonds, right? In neo-paganism, same thing. This is an attack on us, and so therefore we need to come together to complain about this, right?
Yeah.
I'm appalled from a cultural point of view, because
Sure.
this is a cultural landmark
Mm.
that is one of, like, when you think of the UK, when you think of England particularly, what do you think of? Buckingham Palace, the Queen, fish and chips, Stonehenge, and maybe going and wandering about Eastbourne, right? Or right, whatever,
Eastbourne.
right? It
Yeah.
doesn't matter, right? I'm really pulling you. I'm really pulling
Yeah,
you.
I can see it. It's all right. I'll let it slide. Yeah.
But it's one of those things, and so any attack on those cultural pieces
Mm-hmm.
is to get performance. And I think that's kind of why I think that it was targeted, particularly because internationally and worldwide, it's one of those symbols of Britain, right?
Right, absolutely, and it's there's it's no coincidence they're doing it the day before the solstice ceremony as well. That's also going to
This
bring
is the thing.
huge because they're going to live stream it live, and the paint's all still going to be there, right? That's the thing. So,
but
yeah.
it is interesting because this same conversation happens again and again and again and again.
Sure.
Right. I know you with you might not want to talk about it much, I know, but the whole hoo-ha about Seahenge, right? Up in Wales,
Yeah.
there was, right, and I know I'm not going to force you to talk about that, but again, similar kind of situation, right?
Sure.
Go up to North Wales. Recently, there was a big hoo-ha about a pagan moot in North Wales wanting to use a beach for to light bonfires and do whatever they were planning on doing, and how when they were told by the local council, you cannot light a bonfire on this beach because it's one of the more popular beaches in North Wales, they then took it as, this is anti-paganism. We have a right to this place because it was used as a port by the ancient Romans. And they were really I had to roll my eyes at it, right? But it was the same sort of thing, right? This is an attack against paganism. How dare you disagree with our entitlement to this place? Millions of people, millions of ancestors in between now and when it was a Roman port 2,000 years ago. Come on, what are you saying? Come on.
Yeah, it reminds me of the we mentioned him earlier, the King Arthur Druid guy, so the Johnny Rockwell Druid bunch, where this was like what 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I think it was. He kicked up a whole, or him and his whole bunch, they kicked up a huge fuss about having to pay for parking at Stonehenge because they said, oh well, this is a pagan pilgrimage site. We should be getting it for free because we're active members of this temple. Well, one, there's no evidence it was ever a temple. Like, there's some evidence it was used for communal feasting, sure, which may indicate that it could have been some kind of pilgrimage site, maybe, sure, but that's entirely speculative, right? But he picked up this huge thing with his whole branch of Druidry that because it's a pagan site that he and his ancestors and one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I saw this in some of the interviews and articles that he did, is when you look at his construction of what British identity is. How he defines what it means to be British and how he defines what Britain and the UK is, because to him it's very romanticized. He generally, in his view of thinking, it's not the UK is not a country, it's a land, right? It's a collective landscape, which inherently taps into that kind of romantic folkloric notion of what it is, rather than like a modern. He's very kind of, and I'm saying him just like that branch, like it's a very kind of extremist branch of like neo-druidry, right? But that community in general, they are rejecting like modern political notions of identity, and they are in turn they are turning to those older conceptions of folkloric identity, right? Which is kind of interesting. I don't know why it's happening, but it's an interesting kind of shift.
There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to it, right? I think again, it says a lot more about where they're at and their relationship and their concepts of where they're at and how they relate to the landscape of the country around them. What's interesting is that I don't think that it's necessarily just a neo-pagan thing. I think it's a very human thing.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. I think that this kind of conversation will pop up in depending. I think part of it is colonialism. I think part of it is globalization. I think part of it is the fact that displacement, like 150 years ago, when you have people writing, bring it back to the folklore stuff, right? When you have people going into these communities and asking stories, the majority of these people and their ancestors had been part of these communities forever, right, for a very, very long time. So those continuations in these regions were continuations that have been passed down for a very long time. They may have changed every generation and upon the retelling. They may have had a lot of external influences, but for them, there was no sense of suddenly needing to create spaces, needing to create communities. Whereas now, we have people who are, again, in the diaspora, looking back to the homelands of Europe, right? Trying to create a bond, and oftentimes that's through romanticized views. You have people within societies that are rejecting the social norms of secularism or Christianity or whatever the monoculture is, right? And so wanting to create spaces and create traditions and create new forms of community. Oftentimes people are having to drive 2 or 3 hours in order to go to these places, right? So it's interesting, but I think it's very understandable. I mean, I certainly I engage with that myself, right? I think you engage with that too, right? You know, when you go to Egypt, and you've been to Egypt, haven't you?
I have not, no, believe it or not. It's
I'm
a
shocked.
travesty. I know it is an absolute travesty. I will say though, I have some weird. Oh, I don't want to romanticize it. I have some weird karma with Egypt. It's an interesting thing.
Oh,
I've almost been 4 times. An emphasis on the almost in the sense that like I'm within a week of going, and unanimously every single time for 4 times something has happened in the region that has cancelled my flights and trip. It's like whether it was like protests going on in the country over presidential elections back in 2011, whether it was ISIS and ISIL when that blew up in sort of 2013, 2014, 2015. Times where I was scheduled to go on excavation and then everything else, kind of like the refugee crisis blew up and then closing borders, or more recently when the whole Israel-Palestine war happened, which is now obviously, because on the border with Egypt, it's causing like all kinds of issues. So like things have been closed off to a lot of archaeologists and everything. So it's like some, I don't know what it is. It's some weird narrative that I'm noticing and observing, that every time I almost go within a week, it gets cancelled and someone kicks me out of the country. So I don't know. It's a weird thing, but yes, I hear your point. It's the same thing as like whether it's Egypt, whether it's Greek philosophy. You know, I saw a post on one of my social medias the other day about somebody who was very offended about, I can't remember what, I didn't catch the beginning of the original thread, but they were very offended about somebody, someone more like arguably more Western than Greece, or this idea of kind of someone from Central Europe rather than Greece claiming to know more about Greek philosophy. And then this person who was a native Greek was very much like, well, you've studied this in books. Like, this is our cultural legacy because we've lived with this philosophy. And they were very kind of, very vitriolic around kind of saying, this is our philosophy. It's our stuff. It's very kind of nationalized. Very interesting. And, I guess it opens another interesting kind of dialogue box here around the line between kind of appropriation and integration. It's like, at what point are we, when you're studying a culture and you're immersing yourself in the culture, where do we find that line between healthily integrating it in a sustainable way that is actually beneficial to yourself and to the culture in question, and then appropriating? Like, what's the actual line or boundary there between what makes something cultural appropriation and not, I guess, is the dialogue I guess we can have here. And it is a hard question.
Well, I actually don't know anymore. I thought that I knew. I honestly thought that I knew up until a few years ago. I thought that I knew. One of the things that has really underscored for me is, again, coming back to that idea of how little I know, right? I've been very challenged in many of those ways because many of the spiritual traditions I've been part of have been ones that I wasn't born in. They were living cultures. They were very gracious, and I found places within them, with the caveat that I wasn't born into them. In looking then at kind of what's going on, I don't know if there's any general guidelines around that, because I think that it really depends on exactly which thing we're talking about. I would say don't be a dick about it. I would say don't feel entitled to things that aren't yours, like the whole piece around neopaganism, feeling, at least by some, feeling entitled to sites that actually belong to the whole of the culture, right? Is a big thing. But again, I think it really depends, Yeah.
Yeah. It's a difficult thing because like we can't even you can't even really like define it by a knowledge base, for example. So if I was to say, um, if I was to, well, I want to say this without trying to sound arrogant because this isn't what I I have to be very careful with how I say this. Like me, if I was coming at this from an archaeological or like an Egyptological point of view, I think I could probably say with a relative confidence that I might know more about Egyptian or Greek history than say the average Egyptian, like a person living on the street, right?
Mhm.
Is that then like if we're defining it by knowledge, do I know more about that than them because it's grown up because I haven't grown up in their culture, right? And so it doesn't work. So what's the value? So I think the question here around cultural appropriation is inherently what we value, and that changes with culture and whatever zeitgeist is currently going through, right? So what is defined as cultural appropriation is also equally proportionate, I think, to what we value in a culture as well.
It's true, right? What is our perception of what even constitutes that culture,
Mm,
right? I mean, sitting through some of I've talked to you about some of these classes, right? Sitting with
mm,
experts in this field of classical studies, for example, right? And realizing that classical studies really only see Greek culture through that lens of, maybe a cutoff of 1500 years ago,
mm,
and that after that, anything after that is considered Byzantine or Ottoman or modern, right?
mm,
This idea that of how quickly cultures change too. So, I grew up in Canada, right? Its history only goes back, maybe if we're being, really, like, if we're being like, I can't think of words with it, generous. There we
yeah,
go.
there is. Mm,
300 years, but
mm,
really the Canadian identity really only goes back 150 years. Um, what is that culture? What are we including in that? Are we including any of the Native American culture or of the local indigenous culture and
mm,
their history into that? Well, no, Canadian culture has suppressed that part of its history because they don't consider it part of their history. Same with, again, the classical,
mm.
right? Majority of, like, there's a demarcation between Byzantine studies and classical studies for that reason,
Right.
right? And most people wouldn't even know anything about Byzantine history or Byzantine philosophy. I would argue against that individual. I would be that guy who would
Mm,
argue against that individual that, yes, you might have grown up in modern Greek culture. That doesn't mean that you know anything about ancient classical philosophy,
mm.
right? Because of the centuries that have passed between the living culture that you're in now and that, which is heavily influenced by orthodoxy, right? So it's one of those things. But then who am I even to say that? Because I
Right.
don't
Well,
know. I
yeah, this
didn't
is the
live in that
question.
culture.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't grow up in that culture,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and it reminds me of the difference between sort of Western perceptions of the past and Eastern perceptions of the past, which is really interesting. Because I remember talking to someone in my Discord server about this, where like the difference of how Egyptology, which is obviously my field, is studied in or studied and conceptualized in Western universities that ultimately derive their academic system from Plato and kind of the classical system, and Eastern or even Middle Eastern universities, which derive more of their culture from kind of Muslim or Islamic ideas. And it's really interesting. Like one of the big defining things that works in kind of Western Egyptology is that very strict division into periods. Like you have kind of native golden age Egyptian rule up until the New Kingdom or after, and then from Ptolemaic, which is when the Greeks take over, it's kind of considered a decline, and then the actual native Egyptian goes out of the picture. No one really talks about it. It's considered by a Greek or a Roman colony, and then when Christianity or Islam comes along, it's no longer Egypt anymore. It's Christian Egypt. It's Greek
Nice.
Egypt. It's Muslim Egypt, whatever it is, right?
Nice.
If you learn, but then if you look at Eastern perceptions of that and how Egyptology is conceptualized, or even just Egyptian history is conceptualized in Eastern universities or even Middle Eastern universities that derive from Islamic or Muslim inspiration, they take a lot heavier emphasis on syncretizing with the past and actually connecting to the past. And they focus a lot more on establishing a level of continuity with native Egyptians, as opposed to creating this much more strict hierarchy between, well, this period ended here, this ended here, and now it's this kind of thing. Instead, there's a much more level of kind of, well, there are still native Egyptians living in Egypt, like, and there is some level of continuity going on there. But it's a really interesting dialogue to have between kind of Western and Eastern conceptions of how they consider and connect their ancestors.
It's fabulous. It
Mm.
really is. And I really do, I do hope that this trend in Western academia goes in that direction more.
Yeah.
Like when I was just studying, I was able to take a crusade, a history of the Crusades class
Mm.
from a scholar who originally from Brazil, did his PhD, master's down in Brazil, came up and did his PhD in Toronto, and he's like, I mean, he speaks Greek, he speaks Arabic, he speaks,
Mm.
you know, all of these really cool cultures. He speaks Lombard, which is really, really cool. He said, you know, there's not that much to learn from, but it's, you know,
Yeah.
but the whole course was the Crusades from the Islamic perspective, not from the
Mm.
Western perspective. So it's interesting when you were laying out the Islamic sources and the contemporary Western sources. If you read the Western sources, you of course we believe in Western society that the Crusades was this huge big thing, that it changed the whole Middle East, that it was massive. When you look at the Islamic sources, they're like, oh yes, there's, you know, rumblings off in Haifa, or rumblings off in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
right? What they were more concerned was that the Abbasids and the other caliphates were, you know, about to go to war with each other in other areas. You would
Mm.
never know that if you were just looking at the Western sources,
Mm.
right? The
Right. So they're
Crusades,
selective in what they cover. Yeah.
of course, because in the Western world, the Crusades was this big thing. It brought all these culture, these communities together, these kingdoms together. It was a big, you know, push to, you know, retake the Holy Land, blah blah blah.
Mm. It
Meanwhile, you
almost
know,
sounds like
months.
it's acting in the same way as almost a founding myth, essentially.
It is very much so, right? But you, and this is where the clash of cultures comes from,
Mm.
because that founding myth doesn't translate to the Islamic world, because
Right.
they did not see Jerusalem up until a certain point as being holy, right?
Mm.
By the period of the Crusades, the transition point of seeing Jerusalem as the holy city to Mecca and Medina as being really important had
Mm.
happened already. So they just didn't, they just saw it as some backwater provincial territory in dispute with these people from over there.
Mm.
And that was that. You know, they were more interested in what was happening in Persia, what was happening on the Indian front, what was happening in China. You know, they were more interested in that, you know.
Mm. Yeah.
Humbling as a
Very
Western
humbling.
scholar to be looking at that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's wait. It also makes me wonder again. 'Cause I guess because it always raises the question of bias, right? Bias and sources from certain narratives. And again, if we were to bring this back to folklore and like the
Totally.
reporting
Yeah.
of cutting folk and folklore, to what extent is this also going on in that tradition as well? Where if we go
Oh,
back
it
to the
totally is.
1700, 1800 things where people are recording certain thing. I'm thinking along the lines of like, people like Reginald Scott, even in 1600s,
Mhm.
he's going around with his sort of very strong fever of being like, oh, well, I'm going to try and, discredit all this witchcraft or something going on. And of course, actually, it's the complete opposite ends up happening because he just ends up basically just spreading it all out and making it widely available to people.
Yes.
If you look at people like that, to what extent is there a selective bias there in terms of what people are recording? And I guess in terms of how they're conceptualizing what is magic or witchcraft and folklore and that kind of thing.
Totally.
It's huge.
It's huge. It is. You hit the nail on the head, and like unsurprisingly, because you know this, right? I suspect that many of your viewers will know this too, right? We cannot go into these sources for textual record without understanding first who these people are who are recording this.
Yeah.
What is the cultural context of this time? What are some of the biases? Even the type of language that's being used. You said before the white witch versus black witch, right? Now, 150 years ago, that had a very different connotation to now in the modern neo-pagan, in modern witchcraft scene, we can't say black witch or white witch because it has racial connotations, which didn't happen 150 years ago. There's no record of that. There's no, but nowadays it's how are people, taking up this material in the same way that 150 years ago, when these scholars were troopsing around the neighborhood, asking questions, asking for stories, you can usually tell who is from that region and who isn't because of how they're conceptualizing, how they're talking, the type of language that they're using, what are they focusing on, right? Which is really interesting when we then start to look at different sources. When we've got several sources from the same region, that don't seem to be using each other as sources for each other. That's what really interests me, because you get then different
perspectives and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, yeah.
Yeah. Because I can see that would be, I can imagine, especially if there's contradictions, then I guess that would also then illuminate the person's background and context, right, as well, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And again, if that varies by region as well, if that's that's different in Wales to what it is in England, for example. And the thing that comes to mind when we think about it actually is I guess just like how different continental witchcraft beliefs are with even just English witchcraft beliefs, right? Especially one of the things like is always really interesting to me is the source of power for the witch in the continental witch trials. If we're looking at like Switzerland, Italy, Germany, that kind of area, it's almost always a deal with the devil, right?
Totally.
But
Absolutely.
when we come to England, a lot of the early English witch trials, I'm thinking like the Chelmsford witch trials, things like that, the power and efficacy is by the familiar. And there is no real mention of the devil in English witchcraft until those European trial accounts are brought over and then integrated in by various people,
Well, and that's the thing. You see that distinction, right? And you can see that even in different regions, right? So if we look at kind of the history of Essex and East Anglia, right? Of course, Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General, plays a big part of that, because he was one of the main people of that. When we look at the history of his relationship to the material, he was getting his information and ideas from James I and Fifth, Sixth, whichever one he was.
Sixth, yeah.
And in that material that James was coming up with, imps were really big. And so when you look at Matthew Hopkins and how he was identifying witches, most of them was, food nipples and imps. And so in East Anglia, imps are a big part. And
they're all over the place.
Big part. They're everywhere. But you go up to Yorkshire, you go down to Cornwall, you don't tend to see them as often. Right. So that tells us then, again, that bias of source, that evolution of the stories, is that elements will perpetuate themselves within different regions because of the situation, right? And so because that's what he was looking for, as much of an asshole and piece of shit as he was, that's what he was looking for. So that's what got recorded. And so in those recordings, and this is the interesting thing I found, was the relationship between the oral history tradition and the textual history tradition, and how often they overflowed. So oftentimes you would have chapbooks written about these trials, right? You would have people reading those chapbooks in the 1600s, telling those stories to their children, and then you generate then the oral tradition. And I saw this so many times in these stories. One in particular, the version that is recorded in the 1870s, right, is listed as, I was told this by so-and-so who was like 70 years old, who was told it in childhood from their nanny, whatever, right? So then when you go back through, and I was able to find, like, archive.org is amazing for this. I was able to find that story actually comes from a chapbook from about 150 years before, which tells me, or I suggests to me, that what happened was that nanny heard the story from somebody who had read the book and was telling it as an oral story, who then told it to this child, who then retold it to a folklorist 70 years later. But that folklorist was not aware of that.
Of the original book, yeah.
Right. And so then comparing the two versions, you can see the evolution of the oral tradition within that, because of the differences between what was recorded here, what was recorded here. What are the elements that have somehow managed to be in that later version? Really, really interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah. Wait, no, I'm taking it in. It's great. It's because it makes me think then as well. And like, again, this is we can keep going back around to kind of the founding myths of the neopagan community and stuff. But it makes you question, I guess, and think like how much of what we consider witchcraft in modern sort of neopagan communities, or at least what neopagan communities consider witchcraft, and what their practice is, whether it actually is something that is drawing from traditional sources, whatever folklore sources, and how much of it is oral histories that have been evolved and to a certain extent garbled and things that have come down, what people consider witchcraft today. is not anything really like what cunning folk, for instance, would consider witchcraft.
Well,
If they
there's no
if they
relationship,
even
right?
considered what they were doing witchcraft as well, and that's
Well,
another.
and that's the thing. Majority of them wouldn't have, right?
Yeah.
Majority of them would have seen it. Like a lot of them, the sources tell us they were using the Bible, they were using grimoires, they were using whatever they were able to get their hands on. And I mean, you've talked about this in your own work too, right? They
Mm.
were able to, replicate and create things because although they may have not have been literate, they saw a certain sigil saw a certain seal, right? And history plays a big part in this, right? We see that these charms are being written in almanacs in the 1700s. Astrological information is being shared again after 1732 because of the change in the witchcraft laws, right? And so this information is being put out there again, right? But there's no connection whatever between the modern neo-pagan spiritual religion aspect
Yeah.
and what was happening with the cunning folk, because modern neo-pagans are not going out and helping people find their lost cows. They're not going out there to give, to assist with finding lost money or finding thieves, right? The closest thing that we have in our society now to that, to those cunning folk, are modern mediums and psychics, right?
Mm.
People are going to gain information in order to serve their own life. They're not looking for religious rituals with gods and this and that or the other, right? So
Yeah.
it's interesting. It is interesting. And in truth, when we look at the cunning folk tradition, we can see, and this has been widely studied and it's been put out there, it is a pan-European tradition and it extends into diaspora. So if
Yes.
we look at Caribbean cultures, we look at South American cultures, right? Brujas, curanderismo, espiritismo, right? All of these practitioners of these various different traditions are filling now in those communities the same niche as cunning folk 200, 300 years ago.
Mm.
Much more than neo-pagans, much more than neo-pagans. So
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's. I mean, Jim Baker talks about this in his introduction, which is actually brilliant. One of the things that led to, well, I don't want to say the death. I feel like that feel like it's kind of inflammatory language. The decline of cunning folk traditions was kind of the, like, when we're getting into that late 1800s, early 1900s, like the, I guess, evangelization, almost sort of galvanization of things like theosophy, which are, the center of spirituality is looking more towards either formal lodge structures like Golden Dawn stuff, or it's looking east to things like Tibet, right? Or like spiritualism and that kind of thing, where this kind of whole new interesting wave of spirituality that's coming in, going, oh, well, now everybody has access to this ancient wisdom that's been disseminated. That takes the focus away from kind of folkloric ancestral traditions, which is what a lot of the cunning folk are kind of rooting themselves in, because now suddenly, like, the spiritual wisdom is the collective wisdom of all humanity rather than familial lineages and things, and that kind of contributes to the decline of actual cunning folk traditions as well.
I would definitely agree with him, but I would also extend that to also the need changed, right? People practicing magic in pre-modern and early modern times, right? They weren't doing it for a spiritual reason. They were doing it to get results.
Right, to a practical reason.
Exactly. Like farmers down in Cornwall, and we see this in the Cornish material, right? Farmers in Cornwall were learning astrology in order to learn how to be better farmers and to manage their fields better.
Right. So like knowing when to plant and stuff.
This is the thing. This is why astrological information was in the almanacs, right? So that they could figure out what the moon tides were and what they, and so forth, right? People who were practicing, like grimoire magic, not like on a base level, not the the noble gentry that we often talk about when we're talking about grimoire tradition. They were looking at working with spirits in order to get things, to do things. And oftentimes also many of these were people of the cloth, people of the clergy, right? We know in the grimoire tradition that monastic tradition was very strongly, heavily influenced with the grimoire tradition and ceremonial magic.
Yeah.
What we don't talk too much about is then how folk practice and using the grimoire tradition filtered into Protestant times. There's some wonderful stories in Wales, particularly, of clergy, whether it be nonconformist ministers or even Anglican ministers, using their Bibles in order to work with spirits in order to gain something for their community. There's a wonderful story, and I friggin' love this so much. There is down right on the edge, right near Hay on Wye, two communities about about 3 hours walk from each other, right? And they had a bit of an issue, and so they decided they would have a boxing match. So they designated 2 boxers from each community to have a boxing match. Now, on the day of the boxing match, the one boxer knew that he wouldn't win against his rival because he wasn't as good. So he got the local clergyman to go and open his magic book and sit in a tree halfway between these 2 towns, so that as the boxer from the one town came underneath, he would open his magic book and send his spirits out. Now that tells me, that says, I mean, that's a folklore, that's a story. But it was representing reality, which was the cultural belief that the clergy had power over witches, that the Bible, because of their association with the Bible, a magic book, that they had power in order to affect change. And so all throughout Wales, you see, and the borders, you see clergymen, people would go to them in order to get cures, in order to get charms, in order to get these things, right? Right? I don't think we talk too much about that, because we often now we compartmentalize, grimoire, ceremonial, traditional, the gentry, rich folk, all like Aleister Crowley types, right?
Sure.
Witches. Anyways, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of that kind of arbitrary kind of categorization falls down when you actually look at the texts and what they're doing. Like it's especially with the Cunning Folk, a lot of them are using like Agrippa's fourth book, right? Like whether it's the planetary sigils, the astrology, like what was effectively a very core ceremonial text, especially after I can't remember the day. You might know the day, but when the printing press opens and they all start getting disseminated, that kind of thing. 73. Okay, got you. Like post that day, everyone's using like Agrippa as a core source, or even like a Reginald Scott, or even people like that. And we see this in people like Arthur Gauntlet's Grimoire, stuff like that, right? Like a lot of the material is drawn from like the Heptameron. It's drawn from very core ceremonial texts. It's like there's a question around like whether then they the Cunning Folk know what they're reading because they're largely illiterate, or whether they're looking at it and they're like, oh well, this is a pretty pentacle. I'm going to kind of use this to supplement my my credibility. But then again, be like, we know that some of them were literate at the same time. Like they're not all.
This is the thing. This is a really important point here, is that it depends on the century that we're talking about. By the 1700s, the majority of the landed farmers were literate, because they needed to be literate in order to effectively manage their farms, right? So the types of Cunning Folk we're speaking about, many of them, are recorded as not being literate, so they're using that oral technique that we talked about last time of learning and taking in. Other people are learning to read because of the Bible, right? Literacy starts to really take off by 1650, and you see in the 1700s huge number of people who are literate because of the Bible, the access to the Bible. But also you have then these almanacs, these chapbooks, right? You have this printing culture really changes that literacy piece. So I would say, depending on the century, we can guarantee that yes, they did know what they were doing. So Dr. Harries of Curta Cadno, who's really one of the most famous kind of individuals, and his sons who continued in that tradition, they were very highly literate. He worked as a doctor. There's no evidence that he actually went and trained as a doctor anywhere. So he was more like a barber surgeon, but he had a copy of Gray's Anatomy. He had a copy of various texts whenever he was able to get something. And then he would be implementing this alongside his cunning work. We have like the National Museum of Wales, National Library of Wales, has his grimoire, and when you open it up, you have it's very similar to what people have now, right? He had clippings. He had clippings of pages of astrological information from Zadkiel and other writers of the late 1700s. He had several hand versions of the Ars Goetia and other Goetic texts. And people believe that was his son Joseph who had inserted those and handwritten them, because he was able to get a copy. Now, he handwrote them in English. Both they were able to speak Welsh and English, so you've got some Welsh material in there and English. He knew they knew what they had. They knew what they had.
Yeah.
But if you go back 200 years earlier, probably they didn't know, but they were taking up these sigils because, you know, this information because they knew that it was powerful. This is where abracadabra comes in. The whole charm is perpetuated again and again. Same with the charms of the paper charms, when you open them up and they have the typical agripic kind of
The planetary squares, the sigil.
the planetary squares, exactly. Yes, yeah. So,
Yeah, I remember. God, I remember seeing this in something Al Cummins did. I think it was a lecture, or one of his lectures actually. We actually have evidence of. I think it's buried I think it's like under a pub. Somebody buries one where they make a tablet. I can't remember if it's a lead. I think it's silver actually. Yeah, it's silver because it's lunar. This like this dude like clearly made a silver tablet with Agrippa, or like from Agrippa's planetary square with all the sigils of the moon, all that kind of thing. And on the back of it, it's in like an inscribed curse. It's a curse tablet that's buried under the threshold of a pub. I think it's like Lincolnshire, somewhere like that. It's like somewhere north, I think. I can't remember where it is. I'll have to think. I'll have a look at it and get back to you on it. But it's an interesting thing where it's like it's one of those interesting examples. Like curse tablets, you know, in my record, they're unanimous. They're like everywhere. You know, when you're looking at everything from sort of 4th century Athens,
totally.
all that to kind of the late Rome period, they're totally everywhere. We have them in Britain, at Bath, right? The Bath curse tablet. Although actually the curse tablets at Bath aren't curse tablets technically; they're more like justice things because they're taught sulis. But we have them everywhere. It's like they're pretty ubiquitous across the Roman Empire. And then they start dying down a little bit. But we have that is one example from the early modern period that is kind of the same idea is coming back up, which is really interesting. And then fairly recently, we also got we found another cursed tablet in an area in Germany. I can't remember. This was like 5 months ago, it was like 6 months ago, something like that.
Oh, wow.
So it was really
Wow.
recently. And they found it. It was basically in a late medieval period house. It was basically buried at the bottom of a cistern. So somebody just like basically buried it underneath the cistern in the house. And what's really interesting about it is it has like a couple of like names, things described on it. And one or two of them actually are names that we know from grimoires that were in circulation from medieval periods. And that is a full-on like lead curse tablet that's been, and it's the latest curse tablet that's been found since then that is using sort of similar principles. So the idea is still, like we said at the beginning, like the folk memory is very long, right? And especially in Germany as well. That's kind of its own.
Oh, totally.
Thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, and this is the interesting thing. When you start to, like, one of my projects around Wise Ones is looking at North America too. When you start to look at kind of the transition points, the individual histories, the decades, the centuries, right? What is happening? The same thing will just, when something declines, when a tradition declines, a particular form of material culture declines, it'll tend to pop up in a different form. So cursing is not going to go away. People curse in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is when you look at the diaspora in North America, you can see that those same types of needs, right, just perpetuate in different ways. A scholar I know, Brandon Weston, who his stuff is really the Ozark tradition. So the Ozarks are right like Arkansas, kind of just above Alabama in that region there, right?
Right.
And he was saying how like his work is mostly magic and material culture of the past 200 years. When you look at cursing, it was more common because a lot of those people were Scots and Irish, right? They would then turn to their Bible to curse, and they would have a cursing Bible. So there are certain charms that are using like biblical citations, right? Biblical texts. And he found one. He went and found this really old Bible. It was like 80 or 90 years old. Somebody was getting rid of it. He found it. And when he flipped through, because he knew what he was looking for, he found that there was a certain quotation, and this is a very typical cursing quotation from the Bible, piece of scripture. And it's something along the lines of, I think it's like, I can't think what he calls it, but it's basically a curse for blood. So, may he fall and may he trip and may his blood flow like the holy blood on Calvary, that kind of thing, right?
Sure.
And next to it was a list of people, and one of two of them had their names crossed out, right? So the cursing tablet, is
It's,
now
yeah,
in the Bible, right?
yeah, so it's
Yeah.
still our
And
idea.
these are the traditions that I'm sure would have also and he makes the case himself. These are things that you would have found in Europe too.
Mm.
Right. But because books, they tend not to be printed very well, so they tend to deteriorate a lot faster than, say, meticulously crafted silver tablets, right?
Right, and I suppose as well, if we're thinking about it from like a manuscript tradition, or like a papyri, or it wouldn't be papyri, so it would be manuscript at this point, like a vellum kind of manuscript tradition. Especially if they're writing names like down the side, like in theory, like in the margin, right? It's marginalia. If that then gets passed around and spread around through different families, whatever it is, we are potentially also then looking at people will, as the manuscript kind of changes hands, people will look at the names in the margin and then think that they are part of the spell. So then then the names will sometimes get filtered into the actual spell as part of the conjuration as well, which is really funny and really interesting when that happens.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
That's
It's
really interesting to me.
really
I love that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
really
yeah, yeah.
interesting. Yeah. But it's also interesting as well, like looking at it the other way, because like we're talking here about ceremonial text, like the high kind of elite clergy text, going that way into kind of the folk tradition, but it also goes the other way. Like I'm thinking at the same time, like because again, this is something that I think a lot of people I see, especially on kind of occultist social media, it's pretty big on occult Facebook. People have this perception like the ceremonial around like the Goetic Keir Solomon tradition, that kind of thing. It's its own beast, and they're very much, oh well, it's very much kind of archaic Goetia, PGM, Greek magic, that kind of thing into this kind of stuff. It's like I understand it, but at the same time, these texts were composed in these cultural milieus, right? Like they're not composed in isolation where people are just drawing from archaic Goetia or PGM stuff, right? And I'm thinking along the lines of like in quite a few of the receptions of the Keir Solomon, we have the sieve and shears, right? Like the basic divination thing. Like that is core folk. It's very folky, right? It's a standard thing by the Cunning Folk. That doesn't come from like a PGM source or like an archaic goetic source. That's purely like entirely. I mean, even the Keir Solomon, at least the lesser Keir Solomon tradition, is distinctly Anglophone as well, right? So it's very much England focused. Like they are drawing from the traditions that are going on during their day, right? And that goes the other way into the ceremonial tradition as well.
It very much does, right? And I put my hand up here. The Grimoire tradition is not a huge wheelhouse for me. I'm getting into it more, but I can't speak too specifically. If Jake Stratton Kent was still with us, I would have suggested that he come on. But it is one of those things. It does become a thing. People will see a book as and I think that's a very medieval kind of approach that's still with us. Right? This is the text. This is the text. But even like Al Cummins said, and a couple of other commentators say, when you start to look at different versions, you start to see how those versions have evolved, how they become different because of the need, and how some of the spirits within them seem to also evolve too, right?
Yeah, whether the appearance changes and stuff.
Exactly, right. And so that then, I mean, that leads into more esoteric sort of discussion, right? Like, what is the evolution of spirits and whatnot? But I mean, with PGM, for example, right? How many versions of PGM where there are huge tracts of it, of charms that don't exist in other forms, in other manuscripts? Manuscript culture is not inherently orthodox. It is constantly evolving. We see this with all sorts of different types of manuscripts. Looking at like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, right? How many different versions of that we actually have? We're used to one version because of print culture and like one particular version being printed. But when you look at the actual manuscripts themselves, there are people who, like the scribes, will have gone on to add to that manuscript. You will have, stories that are completed, right? I just thinking off the top of my head, one example. We see this in various different ways, right?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that it becomes a beast in itself, and like some of the lore of it even evolves around particular books. I'm thinking of like the Black Book of Orkney. Have you ever come across this?
Is it sort of similar to like the Svalbard tradition for like black books in like Scandinavia and stuff, or?
It's connected. It is connected. There is a connection there. There's not much written about it, unfortunately, because it only appears in several different folklore tales. But the basic idea is that this book was written by the devil, which of course we have that story for
Everywhere, yeah.
types of books. Yeah, right.
Sure.
But that the only way that somebody who possesses it can go to heaven is if they pass this book on to somebody else. And usually they sell it for a penny, right? Something like that. But it's interesting then because we don't know what's contained in that book, only that it's written by the devil, right? So it's interesting then, you know, the idea of the mythology that forms even around different books, right? We see this even with grimoires that we have physical copies of, like the Cunning Folk grimoires, right? The idea that, like, Dr. Harry Zakutacadno, I love him so much. You're going to have to forgive me on that. There's a whole folklore around his particular book. We have his book, right? Well, we have a book of
a version of it. It's book.
Yeah. You know, but the way that it's described in the folklore is that he could only open it once a year. He had to have another cunning folk, the cunning man of Pencader, had to come over and assist him with opening it up because, of course, spirits would jump out, and it was bound in chains and all of this, that, and all the other, right? And yet, when what we know was actually probably in it was, you know, extracts from, you know, almanacs and the Ars Goetia, handwritten, and, you know, all these things, right? Not inherently dangerous in themselves, but the thing, the
actual book, the actual vessel itself. Yeah, because we see this. This is something I remember coming across when I read the Lucidarium, right? It's like a grimoire in the same tradition of the Heptameron, and it's something that's missed by even a lot of like the modern reconstructionists for ceremonial magic. Like one of the things that it recommends is like you have to treat the book well. Like not only is there a level of like purity on the part of the practitioner, but like it actually specifies like, you know, the book itself or like the, you know, the manuscript of Recon, it should be placed in a high place, right? You should place it on a shelf. The book shouldn't touch the floor. When you approach the book, you have to wash your hands, make sure there's no oils on your hands. Right? So like the actual physical text itself is important and has some kind of magical power to it at the same time, which is interesting. And we have parallels of that even for like in Greek and Egyptian stuff as well, right? With like the book
totally, all over the world, right?
Stuff all over the world,
like this, yeah. But thinking about that context, then I'll challenge you on this. Think about that context. What is the history of manuscripts in English culture, particularly?
Well, with the Lucidarium, or just
in general. So with books in general.
Oh well, it depends, right? It depends on what period we're talking about, on like in terms of like where they're coming from, whether they're coming from like Italian or German usually, because that's the two, or French maybe. They're like the top three sources if they're coming by like Florence. Like, because Florence especially was a big hub that mediated grimoires into wider Europe. But a lot of the English stuff it's an interesting one. Like a lot of the English manuscripts and a lot of the grimoires, going back to our discussion with spirits is up as well. One of the things I always notice with the English manuscript tradition a lot more is they are drawing a lot more on like general or generic English folklore as well, like even in the description of spirits. Like, and you know, as you said, Jake Stratton comes onto this kind of rabbit hole. If you read a lot of the Anglophone manuscript traditions around, like even the Ars Goetia, for example, a lot of spirits are described as wearing green clothing or green robes, right? Which are very cool, like, you know, brownie, hobgoblin kind of folklore, that kind of stuff, right? But that's distinctly Anglophone, right? If you read the German or the French, that kind of
it doesn't show.
Right. So like there's a manuscript tradition that's emerging where like people are, I don't know, it makes you question like whether we have all the sources, and we obviously don't, right? But like where they're getting these inspirations, because like we have this perception like, you know, manuscripts are these kind of like dead things that, you know, once someone just gets a manuscript, they could kind of read it and they do something with it. But like, especially when you're looking at the marginalia, when people get the reception of manuscript, like the discussion about the reception of manuscripts is that these are living things. They replicate, they're like memes, almost like they replicate themselves. People are actively working on them. They're adding in their own personal experience, and that might be the source of like a lot of how people, you know, the appearances of spirits and things change as well, right? But there's a huge manuscript tradition going on,
Yeah, and also how they're even treated, right? Like even on a more basic level, right? Manuscripts were so costly, And most of the time, people would only see the Bible in manuscript form. People going to church, like peasants and serfs, they weren't seeing manuscripts because they weren't allowed to see manuscripts because they were often in the solarium or they were often, So the only manuscript that they ever saw was the Bible, which of course would be in a high place, right? If they were even allowed to see it. It was, and so there's studies being done around the perception of like, early to mid medieval perceptions of books and manuscripts, and the relationship to relics, because relics were only brought out on special occasions. You venerated them in the same way then you might venerate the manuscripts, right? Because that isn't how they learned about the world around them. They didn't learn about biblical stories through reading because they had images on the walls describing it all. They had the stained glass where it was illustrated for them. They had their pulpit that were being told, and of course then they had the ritual folk traditions where they had mystery plays and whatnot. So manuscripts, just on a not to agree with you, completely agree with you on what you were saying, but just on a very cultural level, right? Manuscripts were objects more than they were text for most people in the world, right? So it's interesting, and in many ways we can find parallels nowadays. Like look at the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib, right? The holy book of Sikhism, are treated as an embodiment of their guru, and that's it. Right? So they're treated to a full buffet dinner. They're put to bed at night. They're treated as a living vessel, and it's interesting that pops up in multiple traditions, multiple cultures across time.
Well, it's also the same thing when you look at like statue animation procedures as well. Right? So like whether you're looking at the Egyptian stuff or like in contemporary traditions, if you look at like Hindu statue animation, right? So I think it's called prana prasthita in Hindu. It's like the inviting or the insouling of a deity into a statue, right? And we have Neoplatonic iamblichus parallels with less.
Totally.
But the thing that's really interesting to me when you look at like modern Hindu statue animation is like the statue, like when you are receiving the deity, it is quite literally it's the same process that you undergo for when you're receiving a guest in your home. Like the initial thing you do, like you wash the statue's feet, you offer it incense, you offer it like betel leaves, all that kind of thing. But like the same process that you are undergoing for welcoming a person into your home, you do it on the statue. Right. And then, but what's really interesting is like once the statue is transported into the temple, it's put away at night to sleep and it's awoken in the morning. And like that whole process is like you arrange it towards the sun, and then in the morning you take the robes off, and then when it's going to bed you reverse it, so you take it away from the sun, you put you put the pajamas on, essentially put it down to bed. So it is treated as a living object. It's like it's interesting. It's really interesting actually to think about manuscripts as objects more than text. It's a really good point. And like that kind of thing as well, I guess, it's especially if we're looking at how you mentioned the tools and how the tools are revealed, like that also then adds more context to like stuff in the Key of Solomon with how the magical tools are treated as well. Like, the knife or whatever has to be wrapped in linen cloth and only revealed in ceremony. It's like, well, yeah, like look at that, because like that's how Catholic stuff is being done in church. Like they'll reveal the stuff after the altar and stuff like that, right? Yeah.
This is one of my biggest gripes. I had a huge conversation about this online. I can't even think who I was debating this with, but it's this idea of a modern neopagan idea, not to harp on modern neopagans because it's a spiritual thing in general in the West. But it's that harking back to like the Joseph Campbell stuff and Jungian stuff, and looking at it as archetypal and looking at it all as
kind of symbol structures and stuff,
as symbolic, exactly, as opposed to understanding that within these cultures and these contexts, right, they weren't understood as symbolic, right? The host being consecrated and being transubstantiated is not symbolic in the medieval period. It is now, because that's how they changed it. That's how they evolved it, right? In the same way that when somebody was crafting a ceremonial dagger, or when somebody was, inscribing whatever it was, whatever they were constructing, they were not seeing it as a symbolic representation. They were seeing it as a legitimate spiritual thing, right? And this idea, Sri Tedest, that's who Sri Tedest post is. I was talking about revision. right?
All
There's a
right.
big, long discussion of revisionism and how this idea of how much harm are we doing by insisting on her story versus his story, right? This
Okay.
whole idea of her story and this idea of revisionism. How much are you actually damaging these traditions if we're not engaging with them in the cultural landscape that they were engaging with at that time? And of course, that changes decade to decade, century to century. But it's really crucial that we as modern people need to, and as academics, as practitioners, whatever, because we then have to deconstruct our own kind of cultural biases, which unfortunately for the past 100 years has been archetypal psychology and Joseph Campbell's stuff. And, I don't want to spit too heavily when I say Joseph Campbell. I used to really like him, but I've seen there's a lot of flaws with his approach, right?
Yeah.
Anyways.
Anyway. Yeah. Anyways, how long have we been going? Actually, we should. We need 2 hours actually, which is interesting.
Oh. Well, only an hour and a half. We've only been going out.
Right, true. Yes, we were catching up beforehand, weren't we? Yeah. Okay, so let's like start bringing it to a close. Now, I guess one of the things I'm interested in, as we talk for the last 10-20 minutes here, integration. I guess with all of this, and I guess this straddles the line of your other kind of work, right, which is psychotherapy and counseling.
Yes.
So, and there is quite I found this myself when I've been in the coaching industry, there is a very lovely line between, or like a very close connection between spirituality and psychotherapy, and they do integrate quite well. So how, in this kind of context here, where people are approaching you with say, their ancestral connections, or they're wanting to approach you with sort of spiritual integration practice, how do you generally approach it then, from a counseling perspective?
Absolutely. So this is where I have to be very, very very careful and cautious because of ethical guidelines, right?
Sure.
Existing and working with ethical guidelines, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate. I tend to approach it generally from a psychotherapy point of view, from therapy point of view, of narrative, looking at narrative. I'm really, really digging narrative therapy lately. I've really found that it's a very useful way of looking at all of this. What is the relationship between who or what or how people are dealing with their life, right? How is spirituality? How is their practice? How is that ancestral connection coming into how they're living their life now? What are they relating to when they think about their ancestral connections or their ancestral story? How is that then impacting how they're walking in their life now? So, very typical one. I've worked with people where they were interested in working with their ancestors, but didn't know how, because all of the traditions that they can think of connected to their ancestors are Christian traditions or secular traditions, but they were practiced by Christians, right? What do they do? Because they're looking at the lens of, what other cultures are doing. So it comes back to the idea of cultural appropriation piece, right? Like, we don't have these rituals. We don't have these ways of approaching it. And so what do? And that's causing a great deal of anxiety for them and a great deal of issue for them, because what's just underneath that surface is oftentimes trauma connected to that birth tradition, right?
Yeah.
So I often we will work on the narrative piece. We'll explore again, what are they relating to? What is the story that they're telling themselves when it comes to this? What are they picking up on when they look at their family story? This is where the other piece around affinity ancestors comes in, right? To me, ancestors are a continuum from biological all the way to non-biological. There are multiple different relationships in there. One thing for me that's really important is, my relationship with the landscape, and not to be bringing a landscape up, but the landscape of Britain, the land of Britain, the country of Britain, right, or the country of the UK, I should say, right? All of those various different narratives and those different experiences, how are they relating to me as ancestral to me, right? So that's how I help clients. It really depends on each one. From the spiritual point of view, like we talk, people will often talk about their spiritual experiences in session because they know that I'm also a practitioner. I have to be very careful there because my role, and same with you with coaching, right? Our role is not to tell anybody what to do. Yeah. Well, maybe with coaching, but
it straddles the lines a little bit, but still on the whole, right? No, absolutely.
right? It's trying to get them to where they need to be on their own merits. They know. It's that idea of like they don't have those words, they don't have that story, they don't have that understanding because it's very subconscious. So it's us getting them to that place. Yeah. I hope that answers the question. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's always fascinating. Yeah, it is. It's interesting there. Like you mentioned your own relationship with, I guess, the land of England and the country of England, and they really are two different things, right? That they really are two different aspects of things. And I suppose like when you extrapolate that into everything else, and that's where like compartmentalization can be very useful, right? And like, especially if we are going down that route of giving people a vocabulary to whether it's articulate their experiences or process whatever they're going through and doing. That's where kind of compartmentalizing things can be quite useful, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and again, compartmentalization is, people say it's a bad thing because oftentimes the idea is that compartmentalization is part of a mental disorder or whatnot, right? Or part of trauma and whatnot. But I think that it's creating nuance. It's understanding nuance. Of course, that's going to be different for different people. So, when people bring their ideas or when people want to talk about their experiences with spirituality and their rituals and their practices and whatnot, I have literally worked with somebody and the topic of the conversation was, what is your relationship to the spirit that you've been working with for however many years? You've noticed it's changing. What comes up in you when we think about that? It's no different from any other type of relationship.
Right. So it's still a relationship. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, I suppose all of this is a relationship as well, right? Whether it's a relationship to the spirit or to the land, to the narrative themselves, all it's a relationship.
Everything's relationship, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, bringing back the grimoires, right? Everybody relates to different grimoires differently. Like, I mean, I'm sure you have your types of grimoires and your particular grimoires that you love to work with. I'm
absolutely.
sure there are other ones that you just cannot stand or even don't want to think about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I can feel you probing to see if you can get me to
No, this isn't a therapy session. No.
I mean, to be fair, I have gone on record on podcast to said I absolutely hate the Osgoatia, but there you go. For numerous reasons that I won't repeat myself stating again, but there you go.
So funny. Well, and everybody does. Like Sam Watt, for example, hates the Kabbalion, hates it, absolutely hates it, doesn't even see it as anything, right? Other people are like, well, we love it. It all depends on relationship, right?
Yeah.
I mean, not to pick on Sam. He won't even listen to this, but whatever.
You never know. Always fun stuff. Yeah. Oh, all right. Let's start wrapping up then. We are an hour and a half in, aren't we? So that'll be a nice place to end. So what? So Wise Ones is the main thing you are working on right now. Is there anything you want to plug about it? Lovely shameless self plug.
Of course. So it is tentatively to come out in June 2025. My publisher is in talks or has suggested, I don't know if he's actually in talks yet, but he suggested that I'll be doing my book launch in one of the London bookstores. So I look forward to finding more out about that. But of course, I'll keep people posted. It will be part of a series. So I'm working on its sequel right now. And Dr. Al Cummins is actually writing forward for it, so that I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say. So that's cool. But yeah, it'll be available 2025. Apart from that, I'm just kind of living my life, trying to move slowly towards the UK. So that's
lovely.
What I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I'll be seeing you soon then, hopefully the next 6 months. We can do an in-person podcast then.
Oh, I'd love that so much. I mean, I'll grow my hair out just so I can.
Sure, yeah. So I'm not alone up here. It's fine.
Well, this has been delightful.
It absolutely has, Ben. Lovely to have you back.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant.
And how about you? What are you up to? What are you up to right now?
I just think I'm going to go more or less quieter for the next year from September onwards because my master's is coming up. But my Hermetica course is still ongoing, but that will probably be ending maybe October, November, probably the end of this year, coinciding. Other than that, I have probably some Hermetica stuff coming out relatively soon. Hermetica, Neoplatonism, that's my new wheelhouse, more or less. But I don't know. Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm just living and being quiet at this point. The more I end up on occult social media, the more I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't want to be here anymore.
Oh, I go through, yeah. I've one of the things, and we haven't really talked about it yet, but I'll
Mm,
briefly put this in there, is going through publishing. I've realized how much you have to push hard against the algorithm just to be noticed, to
yeah.
speak to people, to have people see you, right? So I've been heavily pushing like the podcasting, for example, and it has bore fruits. Like yeah, I was very pleased with my last royalty check. But it is one of those things. It gets exhausting, and I know other creators and other writers have talked about this. um I'm starting to feel like I want to pull back again, focus in, go deep dive, and not be as out there.
Mm,
um yeah, I'm feeling it. But that's the thing. What are we doing, right? What are we doing with ourselves? What's our
right.
goal, right? So that's the other kind of mitigating factor. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it is interesting as well. Like, I'm seeing this, especially in London. There is a general, I don't know, I don't know if I would call it a trend, although I suppose it is getting that way, of
Mm.
like occult online kind of witchcraft creators are scaling down and doing more in-person things on social media. And I think it's just part of a general collective Western push to leave social media. Like I do think that's coming.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
like one of the ways that it's happening is really people are scaling down to doing in-person events and talks or like in-person retreats and things. And part of me also wonders, like, when you look at like the coaching industry or even just the new age spirituality industry, they have some, there is an entire industry of retreats there. Right, like
Oh,
fancy spiritual retreats, most of which have very, very poorly culturally appropriated things going on. But I think there is a demand for like retreats and stuff that are going on, um, that are historically informed or sort of sustainable, that kind of thing, which is great. Like I'm all for. Like, I was talking to the Justin Sledge on a podcast recently, like another recent one, and towards the end we were talking. One of the things he wants to do is go to these like major places that are like relevant in occult history, whether it's like the University of Paris, whatever, and do
mm,
like tours there in person and give like
wow.
lectures in person there. And like he wants to kind of set that up as like a thing that he does. And I'm like, yeah,
Love it.
like it'd be absolutely brilliant. I could see it happening, like across the board, like whether it's me going to archaeological sites and talking about magic in person, or it's like all of us doing it together and going to like major hotspots where there were
Yeah.
cunning folk or whatever it is and doing in-person tours. Like there is a whole demand, I think, for that, which is really interesting. So
Huge, right? I mean, we can even see that online too, right? Foolish
yeah,
Fish did a tour of Watkins. I think it was
yeah.
Watkins or Treadwell. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I was there at the time.
Oh, that's right.
I'm in the
Okay, yeah.
background.
I
I was
thought
in the
so.
background
You're
of the
in the
video. Yeah.
background. I thought I saw you popping
I
around.
was vaguely, yeah, I was kind of just around hanging out. Yeah.
It's great, right? I posted that on my Facebook page and was
Mm.
like, oh, watch this of author friends to see, if you see a
Yeah,
book,
because we've
right?
been around,
And
everyone's books were kind of in there, which was amazing.
right, and the number of people who actually watched it all the way through just for the experience of like being taken through and going, I think that was fabulous. But I like it. There's no being in the actual place. There's no comparison, right?
Yeah, Watkins is a amazing shop. Incredible. I'm forever going there. But yeah, if
As he
yeah,
buys another bookshelf for himself.
yeah, there you go. I'm setting it up. Um, there you go. What can you do?
We should probably end. This was
We
good.
really should. We can keep going. I know we can just shoot the shit for hours, but it's fine. We can wrap up it. So,
Yeah, I really appreciate you. I appreciate all you do, and I appreciate this chance to come and back and do another one. Like after
mm.
3 years, I think that was really cool.
Yeah, it's always good to have
So
a retrospective. Yeah,
yeah, it'll be interesting what another 3 years will bring, right?
absolutely. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll be in person. You never know.
Yes, I know, right? I know. All right.
All right.
Thank you,
Anyway,
Chris.
thanks so much for coming on, man. It's been brilliant as always.
Thank you.
See ya.